My name's Al Jeffries. My date of birth was November 2nd, 1933. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland.
Okay, we're talking here about the Korean War. How did you wind up in the Army to get into the Korean War?
Well, in 1950, on June 20th, I decided to go in the service because I dropped out of high school because of a family problem. And I went down to the recruiting station. They said, come back on, I think it was June the 27th, to get sworn in. And there was a little war started then, but I got sworn in on June 27th or 28th, I don't remember which day, as a regular Army. And I decided I wanted to make the Army a career.
And this is literally just at the time that the Korean War was starting, right?
Yes, I was within 24 hours of when the war started when I got sworn in.
Have you always had timing like that?
Sometimes.
So where'd they send you?
Well,
Where'd you go?
I went to basic training, of course, in Fort Dix, New Jersey. Then I went to the Army Engineering School in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And I remember our graduation, the colonel that was awarding us, telling us how good we did, that we shouldn't get too excited because we were all basically had a rifleman MOS. And from there, I went to Korea.
How much basic training did you really have?
12 weeks. And so, you know, it was the typical basic training at that time. And so finished basic training in Fort Dix and went down to Fort Belvoir, went to school for, I don't know, 8 weeks or something. Wound up in Seattle in the middle of December. Wound up being a Christmas present to the 23rd Regiment sometime between Christmas and New Year of 1950.
You took a luxurious trip over then to Korea?
Not very, not a good trip to Korea, let's put it that way. The final part of that trip was on an LST from Sasebo, Japan to Busan, Korea, and that wasn't a great trip at all.
Rough seas, choppy.
Yeah, it was choppy, and it's a flat bottom boat, and you know, all the typical things that Army people don't like.
You joined the Army, not the Navy.
Yes.
The Marines.
Exactly.
So it was quick. You really.
Oh yeah, it at that point in time, I think almost anybody who was in the service in that June, well, the latter part of 50, if you could still breathe, they sent you to Korea because they were, you know, needed replacements pretty badly. And unlike now, we didn't go as a unit, you just went as a single person, and you were assigned to a company, which is how I got involved in the company I was in.
What was the company?
It was Baker Company, 23rd Regimental Combat Team, the 2nd Infantry Division. I'll tell you a funny thing that we used to kid about. We had one platoon leader who was an absolute gem. I mean, we'd go to hell and back for that guy. But we'd go on a patrol, and he's always 10, 20 yards behind the rest of the patrol. And we, you know, finally one of the platoon sergeants said, "Jeffries, get back there with him." So I went back because I always had a radio on the patrol. It was okay. And then other times they'd send a rifleman back with him, and we could never figure out how come. Well, some years later, we figured it out. A guy 8 weeks before that had been sitting in an office as an accountant, and he was in Korea with a bunch of 18-year-olds who could go forever and a day without stopping. And he just could not keep up. So, you know, it's funny things like that happen. I mean, you know, it's just idiocy. I mean, but, you know, the guy wasn't a coward. He just had a hard time. Another thing that for me was really terrific, for instance, the Commo squad leader that taught me was a World War II veteran. And he knew, and one of the things we used to have to do is we'd run out wire to our outposts when we were in defensive position, and every once in a while the wire would get cut or sprayed, and you have to run out there with your fingertips and run along WE8 wire, and you could feel a break, and you stop and fix it. Well, one of the things that we used to send two guys, a radio man and a rifleman, because the Chinese would every now and again cut the wire and jump the radio guy. But the thing that I remember from that sergeant was, I was out running wire one day, and he said, "Jeff, keep it below the ridge line." He said, "If you come out here at night to check that wire and you're above the ridge line, you're dead." And so those guys taught us a lot. I mean, those World War II guys taught us a heck of a lot, and I'm sure it kept a lot of us alive. So there's little stuff like that that you don't think about, but was really important to us.
It does make you think that at the time there were plenty of veterans from World War II, but so many people like you, or like this lieutenant you're talking about, had been reservists and didn't think they
I wasn't a reservist.
I know, but like your lieutenant had been.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He had gotten out of World War II and was in the reserves and got called up, just like Captain Pratt. He got called up he had retired after World War II and got called back to Korea. So a lot of those guys were there, but particularly, at least the sergeants I'd run into taught us a lot, kept us alive.
It kind of takes me back to what you were talking about early on. You had 12 weeks of basic training, but then that couldn't have really prepared you for what you really dealt with.
Well, it taught you, we had a first sergeant in basic training issue. He used to list, and he says, "You guys are all mad at me." He says, "I keep you alive when you go to Korea." And he was right. I mean, you learned your lessons well. And the guys there, the World War II veterans, were really helpful. And I'd go to hell and back for Sherman Pratt. I mean, he took good care of his troops. Those guys were great. I mean,
They had the experience and the common sense know-how.
Yeah. And, stuff that you don't know unless you've been there and done it.
How long were you actually on the ground in Korea before you really got into combat?
Probably a week at the most. We landed, got assigned to a company, and they took us out and dumped us off, and we reported to the company. And in the particular case, the company I was in, we were in a firefight probably in the next couple of days.
So you're on the ground in Korea. How old are you now?
18.
Did you have any idea what you were getting into?
You mean when I went in the Army? I went in as an infantryman. I wanted to be, that was the place to go. I didn't have a high school diploma at that point in time. And I wanted to be in the Army. And, growing up during World War II, we'd seen a lot of war films, and I thought the Army was a good place to go for a kid without a home and no education. So, you take what they give you to do.
So you immediately, pardon me, I can almost talk today. You immediately got into combat then, and what was the first experience like? That had to be terrifying at 18.
It's hard. It's hard to remember. The first thing. In fact, one of the things I did when you said you wanted to talk to me was go back and look at some letters I'd written, not to my girlfriend, not my wife, to verify some things that for almost 60 years now I've been wondering, were they true or not? You just don't know. Your mind plays such. I think you talk to a lot of guys, and they've amplified their experiences quite a bit. And I wanted to, try to make sure I was as accurate as I could be based on both the letters I'd written, what I remembered, and also looking at Sherm's book, because that gave me a good idea.
Now, whereabouts were you when you started here?
We were at a place called Twin Tunnels, which was just a little bit south east of Seoul.
What was the weather like at that time?
Cold, snowy, nasty is the best way to put it. where we were south of Seoul, it wasn't as bad as the guys at the Chosun Reservoir. We were cold, we had snow, but you know, for the most part, we were okay. I mean, we were able to keep warm. I mean, not warm, be warm enough to be able to survive, let's put it that way.
Now, was it kind of constant combat right from that point on?
Well, it would be, you know, you get in a firefight and the Chinese would pull back or we'd pull back and you get a couple of days of respite and then you get in another firefight because we were trying to move forward and, you know, we'd get in firefights and sometimes you'd be in reserve and you'd dig in a defensive position and 2 or 3 days later you'd be in a firefight. One of the things that, for whatever reason, our company, a number of platoons got tagged for patrols. So we were often on patrol. I mean, a lot of times you go out on a patrol and there would be no encounter with the enemy. Other times you might get a firefight in which you'd drag your butts out of it. But, you know, I guess the best way to describe it, Phil, is that during that period of time, we were in firefights pretty regularly because we were pressing the Chinese to move forward. And, you know, the Twin Tunnels, which was the first major engagement I was involved in, Sherm talks about it as, you know, we took a lot of casualties, we inflicted a lot of casualties on the enemy. And nobody knows exactly how many.
What kind of odds were you up against?
Say again, what?
What kind of odds were you up against?
Mostly we were outnumbered considerably. I mean, our regiment, the encounter in which I get hit at Chipyeong-ni, they said we were facing almost a whole Chinese army. And I don't know exactly what those odds are. Sherm's got it documented in the book, but we were greatly outnumbered at that point in time.
It was that way pretty much through the war, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, yes, it was. But, you know, after Chipyeong-ni, we started to move north, and the odds were always pretty against us at that point in time. But we began to make inroads on the Chinese, and with a change of command, they decided they were going to go north, and we were able to do that. In between the Twin Tunnels and Chipyeong-ni, at least, we found out that we, the Americans, could stand up against the Chinese assaults, which were pretty bloody most of the time.
So at this point, you're kind of fighting your way back up, and this is kind of before everything stalemates.
Oh yeah, long before the stalemate. This was in 1950. The stalemate was 53, so we were just in the beginning of the war.
Well, here's so much, you know, all the fiction and everything that you do see and hear about Korea, but so much you hear is taking a hill and having to go back and take it again.
Yeah.
Was there some of that too?
Oh yeah, that's why we went back up the hill. The Chinese had driven off 2 companies at night, and then another company had gone to try to get the hill back, and they were unsuccessful. And so we got the job of getting the hill. And we essentially occupied our side of the hill. We never got over the crest of the hill, but at least we kept the Chinese from their observation points. And of course, Sherman in the book says he accomplished his mission but lost half his company.
How high were these things? Are they?
Well, I don't know. I would guess this hill was probably somewhere around 500-600 feet above the valley. Yes, in some cases they were mountainous, but in this particular case, the hill was probably 500-600 feet.
But it was important for observation.
Well, if we had not gotten that hill back, the Chinese could have broken through the perimeter, and they'd been in the middle of a trapped regiment because they had us totally surrounded. I started out as a rifleman, assistant BAR operator. So the first firefight, I guess, I didn't frankly know what the hay was going on. I mean, I was just following the gunner around, whatever he wanted me to do. And I don't even remember exactly what transpired in that situation. But not long after, we lost a couple of radio operators, and the company commander said, Jeffries, you can speak English, you're dependable, you're a radio operator. So I got assigned to a communications squad in a rifle company.
So as you're going through all this, you're a radio operator. Were you up forward?
Well, every organization, for instance, when at Chipyangni, we went to an assault with 3 platoons, and every platoon had a radio operator, and the squads had radio operators also. They only carried a small walkie-talkie, but I had a 30-pound radio with a 10-foot whip, and our job was to keep the platoon leaders and the CO in communication with each other.
So you were basically a coordinator then to kind of make sure that.
Well, all we really did was relay. Like if our platoon leader wanted to know something, he might say, "Hey, Jeff, find out about mortar fire," which was one of the things was going on when I got hit. Or he may say, "Give me the radio." It just depended on the situation. But our job was to maintain communications, both by radio and sound-powered phones, depending on what the situation was.
Were communications good at that time? Could you keep in close contact with the
Oh,
other
we could talk to our officers back at the company headquarters when we were in the assault. The company headquarters guys and heavy weapons platoons and stuff like that, we could talk to them, but we couldn't talk to anybody else.
So you weren't over there that long before you were wounded.
Yeah, I wasn't. The life expectancy of a radio operator, a BAR operator, or a medic was very, very short. And one of the reasons I got in a radio squad was they kept knocking off radio operators because you had a 10-foot whip and it just said, "Here I come." And the Chinese were smart enough to realize if they could disrupt the communications, then they could disrupt the command structure.
Did you know any of this at the time when you got into this situation?
What do you mean, did I know what?
Did you know what the danger was?
Oh, yeah, sure. We all knew it. I mean, it was a common knowledge. I mean, the ratio was always made up by the guys, but we knew radio operators were very vulnerable.
What makes you volunteer or take on something like that?
You're in the Army, they gave you a job to do, you did it. And when I got hit, I gave my radio to somebody else.
How were you armed as a radio man?
Well, when they stuck me on a radio, they gave me a .45 and I had a carbine, so those are the 2 weapons I carried. Never used a .45, but shot the heck out of that carbine. Probably saved my life.
45s weren't that reliable, were they?
Well, they were good if you were in a foxhole in a sleeping bag with the phones on. You could take it out and lay it on your chest just in case somebody decided to keep you company. But other than that, you never. I think I fired it one time to make sure it worked, and that was it.
So how long were you in combat?
Well, from the January to February, late December, early January till February 15th in 1950. When I got hit, I got knocked on my butt, and I'd been talking to the CO, and I said, "I'm hit," and he said, "Give that radio to somebody else, soldier." And so in his book, he talks about he reestablished radio contact with his attacking platoon. And when I read that, I called him and said, "Hey, the last time you and I had a telephone conversation, you said, 'Give that radio to somebody, soldier.'" And I said, it took us probably 10 or 15 minutes, first for somebody to get to me because we were pinned down, and then for me to get the radio off and get it on another guy and just show him he had just had to learn how to turn the squelch and push the talk, and that was it.
Where were you when this happened?
We had been trapped. The regiment had been trapped. And the Chinese had driven off two of our companies off of a high ridge, and they were able to just look down our throats. We were totally vulnerable as a regiment. In fact, the regimental CO got hit in the thigh with a rifle bullet. They were dropping mortar fire in on us, and in fact, my company commander in his book talks about when he was sending us off in the assault, that guys were dropping all around him. He got, it's a funny story, I loved it. Sherm said a mortar round went off and he felt something running down his leg. And he thought, oh God, I'm hit. But then he realized it was cold. And what had happened was a mortar round had pierced his canteen, and his canteen was running down his leg. They had kept throwing guys at this hill to get it back, and they finally committed our company. And Sherm talks about us being at a railroad embankment and going over it, and we probably had to go, I'm going to guess, somewhere between 150 and 200 yards across open space, and the Chinese were just shooting at us the whole time. I mean, in fact, Sherm was at the CO, and that's when the mortar fire was coming in. And he talks about in his book, a machine gun strafed the company operations center. So we took some casualties there, but we really took most of the casualties going up the hill, because the Chinese were on the top of the hill and we were at the bottom. I think every one of the platoon sergeants was killed. A couple of the platoon leaders were killed. A lot of enlisted men, and of course a lot of us got wounded. If you read his book, he describes it in great detail. We were getting hit pretty badly, and they had sent another company up to try to get this hill back, and they'd gotten beat off. And so we had been a reserve company, and they committed us to try to get the hill back, and we had to go across a 150, 200 yard open space and go up that hill. And we were almost the top of the hill. In fact, Sherm in his book, and I'm giving you an account from what he had said. I was there, and we were kind of throwing grenades at each other. We finally got to the top of the hill, and I was probably, I'm going to guess, maybe 50 yards from the crest, and the platoon leader had signaled he wanted me to come up, and I had been behind some sort of cover, and as soon as I got out, I got hit. I think I saw the guy that shot me, because he was only 50 yards away at most. And sparks flew, and I went down, and it probably saved my life, because I had a bunch of empty clips in my pile jacket. When you finished firing a clip, you just threw it in your pile jacket, and I had probably, by then, maybe 4 or 5 clips. And they probably saved my life, because I took 2 rounds in my chest and some shrapnel, and dumped the clip at the guy that I thought was shooting at me, and I don't know what happened then.
Just a reflex to.
Well, yeah, you just happened. I mean, I'd seen this guy, and he had a bipod weapon, and you know, he was certainly looking at me. I didn't pay much attention to him. Frankly, I was trying to get up the hill.
How long was it before they got to you to evacuate you?
I don't know. A medic gave me a shot of morphine, certainly within the hour. A couple of guys were going back for ammunition and helped me back. I mean, I was pretty torn up then. My big hole in my side and blood everywhere.
Was he able to stop the bleeding, or did it just kind of stop itself?
Back in those days, I had a very, very fast coagulation rate, and it was cold. And so that really helped a lot. Well, fortunately, the guys got me back to a Jeep. There's a railroad bridge, and the Jeep took me back to an evacuation point, and I was helicoptered out of there within probably 2 hours of getting hit. That's the only kind of helicopters we had in Korea. There was no assault. I mean, all the helicopters were medvac. Now, once in a while, a CO would try to get a ride to see what was going on, but most of the helicopters were medvac, and they were just little broomsticks. I mean, you rode on the outside in a litter. It's one of the things I remember. I couldn't figure out what was going on when I was in the helicopter because it seemed to me that the ground was getting smaller, and then I passed out. But, you know, they were just put you in a litter and take you off. 2 guys in a helicopter. Those guys were brave. I mean, you knocked down one of those broomsticks with an automatic weapon and no sweat, no strain. But those guys were great. I mean, if I hadn't gotten a helicopter ride, I couldn't have ridden out on an ambulance. I was too badly shot up. And went to a MASH unit, and those guys did one heck of a job. I mean, they saved my life. Every doctor that I've talked to and medical people said, you know, I'm very fortunate. In World War II, I would have never made it. But I was very fortunate.
Were they fairly close to the lines?
I think the MASH units were like 10 or 15 miles back. They were outside of our perimeter, so they coptered me out, and I wound up in a MASH unit.
All we know about MASH units is television.
Yeah.
Were they a little bit like that? Or
Yeah, they were. I mean, not that kind of crazy stuff. I mean, you know, that they did a bang-up job of keeping people alive. I mean, I remember after when I got there, I was going to fight the war, and I was on a cot, and I got up, and everything went clattering down. So I was out of it for a while after that. But as far as I can tell, they just did a good job on me. I mean, I lost most of my gallbladder, and my spleen. I get perforated liver, perforated intestines, tore out about 8 inches of my rib. I've got a big hole in the side. So they just sewed me up and kept me alive. They did a good job.
How long did you take to recover after all this?
I wound up going back to limited duty in October of 1950.
You're talking about the MASHs, and what kind of facilities did they have? Were they tents?
They were tents. They were just big, huge tents.
And just so when you see things like on the show MASH, where they had buildings and things that were kind of semi-permanent, but it wasn't like that. They were,
That's why they got their name, Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals. They'd pack up their tents and move. Now, if they were, you know, in a village somewhere, they might use a hooch or something, but primarily they were just tents.
What about your outfit? They were surrounded. What happened to them?
The 5th Cav came up the late afternoon of the day I got hit, and they were able to break through. They lost a lot of guys coming up to us, and then they called in a few airstrikes, and the Chinese just disappeared, so they were able to pull the regiment out of there.
What kind of air support was there during the time you were there?
We had reasonably good air support. If they called in an airstrike, we got it. We liked the P-51s much better than we did the jets because the P-51s would stay on the ground longer. The jets would, you know, because they were new and there were mountains, they couldn't stay on the ground very long, except when they were shooting at us.
did that happen much?
Well, for almost 60 years, I thought I remembered us being strafed by a flight of Marine fighters. And I couldn't, you know, just didn't believe that was true. And I remembered the incident, but I was wondering if it was my imagination or not. Well, it turns out a few years ago, my wife found a couple of letters I'd written to her. She wasn't my wife. She named my girlfriend, just a friend from school, where I told her we'd been strafed by friendly fire. The Chinese didn't have anything to strafe us with. And that was most scared I was ever in Korea. I mean, I was scared. I looked up and here's this neon sign coming out as a F4, and I was a radio operator, and I couldn't talk to the fighters, but I could talk to their liaison. So I remember the call sign. He was Mosquito Tumbleweed, and we were in Spire Baker. And I got on the radio just yelling at him, and he called the fighters off, and that was it. They didn't hit any of us.
But they just didn't have the communication at that time to know exactly where you were then, did they?
Well, they should have known where we were. We had we had air panels out, but we were so far out in front of the rest of the American Army. They must have thought we were Chinese because we were up on top of a hill. So, but fortunately, nobody got hit, and I got a hold of the liaison guy, and he called them off. So.
You might have saved some lives that day.
Well, the only thing I know is I told the platoon leader who was leading the patrol, I said, I don't know why we're fighting the Chinese. Just send those F4s after them. But it was a scary event for me anyway. And like I said, I thought it was my imagination all these years until my wife found that letter, and I said we'd been strafed.
Do you have any idea how many troops were deployed over there at that time?
No, but I know what the casualty rate was. Over 50,000 killed and 102 or 3,000 wounded. In Korea, we lost our casualty rate in the 3 years of the Korean War was the same as the casualty rate for 10 years in Vietnam. In the same, 50,000, there were some odd numbers, but that's essentially the casualty rate figures.
At any point, did you think the politics ever got in the way of things that you could have done to maybe win the war, or?
Like I said, being a grunt, my understanding of the war at that time was 500 yards out, because that's about as far as an M1 Garand could shoot accurately. But I do think, if you read the history, we were reluctant to cross the Yalu River and bomb the Chinese infrastructure. There's all the debate in the United Nations about that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I mean, at that point in time, I was just a kid fighting a war, and the politics. But if you read the history of the war, there was a lot of politics involved. The other thing that people don't realize is that it truly was a United Nations effort, because, like, we had a French company attached to us, and there were Turks and all sorts of other countries were there doing various things in the war. So it wasn't just the United States. Although we had, as usual, we had the most people there, but there were a lot of other countries there that were involved in the war.
Were these frontline combat units, or were they supporting what you were doing?
The French were frontline combat units. They were right with us. Yeah, they were right there with us. They bled like everybody else did.
What about the Turks?
I didn't have an associate. I've read about them, but we didn't see the Turks. I saw the French guys, but I didn't see the Turks.
What about the Koreans, either the civilians or the military? Did you have any dealings with them?
We had, when I was there, a big chunk of the civilian population had either been carried north by the North Koreans as they were moving back up, retreating, or they had gone south at the beginning of the war, so we didn't see many civilians. But we did have a little boy who was with us, a kid, somebody adopted him, with the company. And we used to kid him. We say, "Boy, son, we're going to go get the Japanese to come help us fight the Koreans." He say, "I go fight for the North Koreans," because there's no love lost between the Koreans and the Japanese. But we saw a few civilian Koreans, but not a. We'd see them, big mobs of them trying to get south when the North Koreans were coming down. But it was, I would say we encountered mostly refugees going south. And there were ROC units, but I didn't have any association with the ROC units.
Now that little boy, does anybody have any idea whatever happened to him?
No, my relationship with that whole thing ended probably about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon on February 15th. I mean, that was the last I knew of any of the people there. I read Sherm's book and gotten to know him pretty well. But other than that, I have no idea what happened to anybody or anything. It just...
And people these days probably think of Korea as being a relatively modern, advanced country. They make a lot of cars and things and TVs. It wasn't like that at the time when you were there.
The last I saw Seoul, it was burning. I mean, the last I saw Korea, I mean, there it was a big fight. Chinese on one side, and the Koreans and the South Koreans and us and the Turks and the French and other people on the other side. And it wasn't the country it is today. But, thanks to the United Nations effort, South Korea is a prosperous, modern democracy, and North Korea is an impoverished dictatorship, and what's to be said?
That's one question. The South Korean troops, were you around them much?
A little bit, not very much. I mean, they were, they did their job. I mean, they collapsed just like everybody else every now and again, but I didn't have a lot of association with the South Koreans.
Now you come back, you've been wounded, your Army career is basically over at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it like when you got back? Did people know what you'd gone through?
Well, of course, I got evacuated to the States and went to a chest and abdomen hospital in Camp Pickett, Virginia. My recollection of the Korean War is that people weren't thrilled by it. Of course, it was a United Nations quote unquote conflict. It wasn't a war. We always kid. We said we were cops because it was a police action. But anyway, I don't think people were. I think people were just tired of war. Period. Korea was like 5 years after the end of World War II. People didn't know where Korea was. I sure didn't know where Korea was. I think people who knew that you'd been in Korea appreciated that you were serving, but in general, I don't think there was a great deal of understanding of what was going on in Korea. That's my recollection. But again, it's been a long time.
But as the years go by, do less and less people really understand what Korea was?
Oh yeah, I think that you ask the average person today, most people don't even know about the Korean War. I have grandkids and their teachers many of them don't even know what the Korean War was all about. It was just a 3-year interlude in our history.
Which is ironic because we still have North Korea and they still create problems for us today.
Well, it's 1950 to now. I have to figure 60 years. We've never really resolved that war. We have a armistice, but we never declared war on them. We've never signed any documents. We still have tons of troops in South Korea, and the North Koreans continue to harass South Korea. So I laugh. Maybe this is a bad thing. You may want to edit it out, but I laugh when people are concerned about us being in Iraq for 4 or 5 years. We've been in Korea for 60 years, and we still have troops there. So it's a perspective on who we were then and who we are now.
We need some education of people to let them know what happened.
Yeah.
When you got back, were there other Korean veterans that you could talk to?
Yes, when I was at Camp Pickett, it was a center for chest and abdomen wounded. So there were a few guys there from Korea, and we talked. I mean, in fact, I was talking to one of my friends today who was a Vietnam veteran. It's hard to talk about some of the stuff that goes on, the people who weren't there. It's just hard to understand some of the crazy things that happen. You know, it's just difficult, and I don't talk about it very much. You know, some of our family once in a while will ask, but I don't talk very much about it.
It's something that when we first started doing these interviews, the World War II veterans hadn't talked very much at that time, which was about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then they began to kind of open up a little bit. And, does time kind of bring it out to where maybe you run into somebody like you ran into Lou? Does that open up conversation?
Oh yeah, sure. We you know, share events. Some of us were at the same place at different times. You know, I've not run into anybody. Now Lou, I think, was at Chip Young Knee, but he was in a whole different battalion and they didn't get chopped up as bad as we did. And you know, once in a while you run into people from Korea, but you know, it's like, I think World War II, there are not a ton of us around, but if you find somebody, you can chat about it. I've got a large group of friends who are Vietnam veterans, and we chat a little bit, but you know, unless somebody raises a particular subject, what's there to say? I mean,
Again, you know so many people, but how many of those people in Broomfield actually know that you were in the Korean War? And I say Korean War.
very few. You know, a couple of my neighbors, guys who were in Vietnam, and we've gotten to talking, but I would suspect not very many people know that. Not very many people know, you know, that, you know, I'd been in combat and got shot up and that sort of thing. But it's not something you talk about.
I gotta jump forward. What did you do with your life then afterwards, since you weren't going to be a career military man?
Well, the month before I got discharged, I said I wanted to go to OCS, and they said, no, you couldn't get in, and plus the fact you're on limited duty, you know, we don't even want you to re-up. So I came out, started dating my wife, and we were just starting to date, and took a couple of different jobs. Thanks to my stuff at Fort Belvoir, I got a job as a draftsman designer in an aerospace company back in those days. Went to Johns Hopkins at night, got a degree. I was an assistant chief engineer for Bendix Radio Company, and the day after I got my degree, I became a chief engineer. And I spent 44 years in the defense industry, various aspects of it, as engineer, engineering manager. I was a president of a company once, and so the Lord was good to me, and thanks to the GI Bill, I got a good education, was able to raise a family, and here I is.
People talk about the forgotten war. Do you have groups that you get together with?
Oh yes, yeah, we have. I'm a member of the 2nd Infantry Division Korean Veterans Alliance, and they have quarterly newspapers. There's a convention every year. I haven't participated simply because the timing's never been right. Plus, you know, probably a large number of the people that I knew were either killed or seriously wounded at Chip Young Knee. In fact, I go through the roster to look for the number of people from Baker Company in that time frame. There's a very limited number of people.
Now, I think we touched just a little bit on reunions and getting together with the unit. Is that kind of good?
Oh, I think it is. It is. I mean, there's a Korean Veterans Alliance in Denver, and I go to their meetings every once in a while, and that's good. The thing for me is having made contact with Sherm, my CO, has been really great because we talk and every February because Chip Young Knee and twin tunnels and that whole thing was to him a very. If you read his book, he says it was Gettysburg of the Korean War for the Chinese certainly, and it's good that he and I talk and email and keep in touch. And I'm not looking. He's getting pretty much up in years. He's crippled by arthritis, and I'm not looking for the day when his wife calls and says he's gone to be with the Lord. But that's been good for me. I mean, that has really been good for me.
How did you happen to get back together with him?
The Second Infantry Division Korean Veterans Alliance puts out a roster of all the people, and also the Korean Monument in Washington has a pamphlet. Well, Sherm was heavily involved in the committee that did that, and so I saw his name, and I remembered, he was my CO, and so I looked him up on the Veterans Alliance, got his phone number, called him up. And that's the first conversation we had. I said, I read this book before, and I said, the last time you and I talked, you said, give that radio to somebody's soldier. And there was silence on the other end of the line, and Sherm said, yes. I said, and I told him, he said, oh, okay. And so we've been talking to each other ever since. So we went back to Maryland, and we visited with him, and we talked about Chip Young Knee and twin tunnels and that sort of thing. And when he gave me the book, he had to put a very nice inscription in the front of it for me. And so that's been great. If they get a hold of a copy of that book, read it. It will give you, I've read a number of books about Korea, but that one, I'm prejudiced, of course. But
Once you pick it up, what is the title of that?
it's called Decisive Battles of the Korean War. And the sub is an infantry company commander's view of the war's most critical engagements. Lieutenant Colonel Sherman W. Pratt, U.S. Army, retired.
Describe the medals on there.
Yeah, let's see. Purple Heart, National Defense, Korean Combat with 2 battle stars, Combat Infantry Badge, and then on the other side is the United Nations Korean Conflict, the Republic of Korea Combat Service, and a Presidential Unit Citation.
The Presidential Unit Citation, that's kind of a special award, isn't it?
Well, it goes to a unit. It doesn't go to an individual soldier, but if you're in the unit, then you get to wear the Presidential Unit Citation.
And which one is that one?
This the blue.
Do you think we ought to really continue and get a lot more Korean veterans on tape like we're doing with you?
It would be good. I think if you can, I think it would be good simply because people don't know much about Korea. At least current people don't know much about Korea. And, it wasn't a real popular thing. I mean, I don't remember how, but it took Congress a while even to decide that they were going to award medals to the people who had been in Korea. And I don't remember that whole story, but I know there was some debate because it was really a police action, not a declared war. And we were fighting under the United Nations banner. And there are all sorts of politics involved in Korea. Of course, the famous MacArthur-Truman battle, everybody knows about that. So, but I told somebody the day before, I think every American kid, I would say male, but now that we have equality, so male or female, at 18 years old ought to be required to spend 2 years in the service because you learn a lot, you grow up, and if you don't cut it in 2 years, you ain't going to cut it on the outside. But who am I? Hey, I'm a has-been. I'm going to be 77 years old, so I'm a has-been. I was talking to a young man and his mother who he's interested in going to the Air Force, and she said, well, would you do it over again? I said, yeah. She said, why? Well, my answer to that is I'd be willing, if I had to defend my country again, if I could. But, you know, they wouldn't take me back. They essentially, when my enlistment was up, they said, no, we don't want you to re-enlist. I was on limited duty anyway, so. You know, 18-year-old, full of vim and vigor. I mean, somebody said, would you do it all over again? I said, yeah, but I couldn't, because if you put a 30-pound radio on my back and handed me a weapon and all the ammunition I could carry, I'd be on my knees, so you'd be safe. I would have gone back, but there was no way anybody wanted me back. There's a bond of respect, and you know, I often think about the guys that are still there that didn't get to come home. And so I consider myself very fortunate. You know, the Lord's been good to me. I mean, like I say, every doctor that looks at me said you should be dead. So I've got no complaints. Obviously, over all these years, I've had a lot of problems, but I'm really fortunate. So I've got no complaints.
And it kind of stayed with you all those years, all those injuries.
Yeah, you know, I've got Hep C and all sorts of other problems, but you know, I'm not complaining. You know, a lot of my friends are still in Korea. I could sit here for hours telling you about idiots things that happen, you know, and you know, stuff you learn and stuff you don't learn, and it's an interesting experience. You know, mine was short but intense, and you know, I just feel myself so fortunate that I made it out. I mean, a lot of my friends are still there.